So Wikileaks is claiming that Julian Assange will be tried under the Espionage Act. Now, this may not sound like news, considering that what the U.S. is supposedly so upset with Assange for is stealing U.S. government secrets. So it makes sense that he would be tried under something called the Espionage Act. However, if he was formally tried or charged under the Espionage Act, the United Kingdom could not extradite him to the U.S. This is because of the top penalty under the Espionage Act is in fact death. So the UK, which does not have a death penalty, refuses to extradite under their law anyone who is facing the death penalty. So therefore, if the U.S. charged him with something under the Espionage Act, it would be impossible for the UK to extradite him to the U.S., and he would just, essentially gain political asylum. Which is why the U.S. had to trump up this lesser hacking charge based on some email exchange between him and Bradley Manning, I believe. Something about trying to guess a password, which I guess we consider that hacking these days. And of course, this is a pretty minor charge, but that's just a way for the U.S. to get Assange's foot in the door, and then once he's here, they can drag him in and, beat him over the head with this Espionage Act charge, which is a capital crime, and could eventually lead to his execution. Now, of course, considering that the British people, by and large, are against the death penalty, if they knew that this was going on, I'm sure that there would be a pretty strong outrage, even considering that most people there, I don't think, are particularly fond of Julian Assange for whatever reason. I think that they all still instinctively oppose the death penalty, so if this were in fact revealed, they might be able to put some political pressure on the British government not to extradite him. Now, getting back to domestic U.S. politics, you may think that it would be a bit of a bad precedent for the Trump administration to charge Julian Assange under the Espionage Act, considering that he is, by many people's definition, a journalist and not a spy. And especially because he only published the information, he did not directly obtain it or take it from the government. The files that WikiLeaks publish are, from as far as we know, given to them by leakers. But it turns out that there is a very strong precedent for charging journalists under the Espionage Act. In fact, the Obama administration, which directly preceded the Trump administration, did it more than all other previous administrations combined. So charging journalists for publishing leaks, government leaks, has become quite commonplace in Washington over the last decade. Even the Bush administration was rather lax when it came to jailing journalists over publishing government information, which is strange considering that the popularity of the Iraq War has only declined in recent years, and that Obama supposedly was elected as an anti-Iraq war president. It does seem odd that we see this big push to try and jail Julian Assange, who's most known for publishing something that was very embarrassing for the military with respect to the Iraq War, which was, of course, his famous Capitol murder video. What WikiLeaks published was a video from a helicopter in Iraq, which, shot and killed some journalists and civilians and even children. Then after these people died, the military gave their bodies back to the families, and the families asked, well, what happened? And they said, oh, well, we can't tell you, that's classified. It was a very secret mission. We can't compromise the safety of our operations, blah, 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 blah. Gave them the usual classified nonsense. But as we found out, just like most classified material held by the U.S. government, it's not classified because it would somehow harm someone for it to be released. It's not like it's endangering the lives of a source or something. This tape was not released because it was embarrassing for the military, because they were embarrassed that they killed innocent people who were non-combatants who were there reporting for Reuters, very mainstream news publication, on the war. The government murdered war correspondents, seemingly by accident. I mean, based on the tape, they seem to have thought that they were carrying weapons when they were actually carrying camera equipment. But then they tried to cover it up. And for exposing this now, exposing the lies about a war that the majority of the American people now oppose, Assange is considered a traitor, even though he was never loyal to the U.S. to begin with, because he's not an American citizen. So people want to see this man hanged for betraying a organization that he was never any sort of a member of. And I'll go back to this more later, but the idea that it's somehow, if by exposing government secrets to the electorate, that you are somehow the traitor is preposterous, considering that the government is supposed to be taking orders from the civilian population. That's how, democracy is supposed to work. As I once heard a British member of Parliament describe it, people in the government are lent sovereignty from the people, but then ultimately they must return it back when they are asked. But I'll get back to that later. For now, I want to focus back on the Espionage Act itself. The Espionage Act was passed in 1917 during the build-up to World War I, in which most people opposed the First World War. President Woodrow Wilson was elected as an anti-war president who was supposed to keep America out of Europe's latest war. However, thanks to the Zimmerman telegram and the sinking of the Lusitania and other factors, Wilson was able to finally get Congress to approve such a war. However, critics within the country against the war were quite widespread, and they were quite problematic. So the Espionage Act, along with other changes in executive policy, was one of the remedies that Wilson went to try and deal with the anti-war people. During World War I, just like the Civil War, anti-war activists were openly jailed for their activism. Eugene Debs, most notably, who was a perennial presidential candidate back then. Ironically, Wilson, who was the progressive Democrat, jailed the socialist Eugene Debs for years in indefinite detention until eventually Eugene Debs was freed by a Republican president. It was either Coolidge or Harding, but it was quite a while later. And so this isn't exactly a new thing for the Espionage Act being used to silence people. And unfortunately, in Eugene Debs's case, he tried to take his case to the Supreme Court to have the Espionage Act declared unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court, just as they always do, they're terrible, unreliable people, the Supreme Court, decided to rule that the Espionage Act was affirmatively constitutional. It was, in fact, upheld. So now we have that terrible precedent, which essentially says that the president can jail whoever he wants for speaking against war. Now, of course, if you ask me, this is for all the people who are so concerned that Assange somehow was responsible for trying to destroy our democracy, as mainstream leftists who wish to see the president impeached tend to say. That is absolutely preposterous. The United States has not been a democracy for a long time. It certainly was not a democracy since the passage of the Espionage Act. And the reason for this is that the government, under a democracy, is supposed to take orders from the civilians. Democracy means that sovereignty is rested within the people. However, based on the Espionage Act, there are certain things that the people are allowed to criticize with respect to the actions of the state. There are only certain things that the people are allowed to know. They're not allowed to be privy to the information of everything that the state is doing. Therefore, to that extent, they can have no control over the state. The national security state essentially operates independent of democracy. Therefore, sovereignty does not rest within the hands of the people. It rests in the hands of the war state. The war state, over many decades, has secured more and more power and wrestled it away from the people, so you cannot accurately call the United States a democracy. If the elections cannot hold the government accountable, if the people who are voting do not have access to all necessary information, then the elections are really meaningless. They're shams. People may be able to elect who they want freely and fairly. The person who they elect may actually win. However, who wins and who loses has little meaning when the civilian administration is stripped of so much power. And of course, we might also be able to surmise that if the people, the electorate, had access to all relevant information with respect to the goings-on of the state, that they might elect different people who would be willing to stop certain things that they don't necessarily know about, such as, the various regime change operations which have taken place since, the entire 20th and now 21st century. Perhaps if the American people were allowed to know about the failures of the national security state in various missions, then they might be able to elect different people who perhaps would pursue different strategies that may be more or less successful. This is why the war state is the enemy of the American people and why Assange is a hero. He was transferring power back to the electorate by taking these quote-unquote stolen documents, which don't belong to the war state, which belong in fact to the electorate, and returning them to their rightful owners. The very concept of classification, which, as I said, is only used to hide things that are embarrassing for the government from the electorate, is inherently undemocratic. Company employees are not allowed to hide secrets from their shareholders. I mean, this is frankly even more ridiculous than if, say, the president decided to classify the economic reports every time that there was a recession so that the electorate never knew when there was such a recession. But of course, you could have then deduce, based on the fact that the president classified the data, that we were probably in a recession at that time. Of course, the same is true of regular classified documents. If the document is classified, you can pretty much guarantee that this is going to embarrass somebody in the government, and that they're hiding something that the electorate doesn't want to know. They don't want the electorate to be well informed when it comes to election time. What the war state wants is for the electorate to elect people who will allow the war state to continue on unabated. And this is typically the case, considering that most politicians are quite ignorant when it comes to these matters, because as civilians themselves, politicians don't necessarily have all the knowledge, and they rely on their handlers in the national security state to really give them most of their advice. I highly doubt, for example, that George W. Bush really could know off the top of his hand the difference between Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda, which is, frankly, it's public domain information. That's not even classified. But if he didn't know that, you can be sure as hell that he and everyone else who's elected pretty much knew nothing of the genocide in Nicaragua back in the 80s. And that's why they continue to reappoint people like Elliot Abrams, who were complicit in genocides like that, because the national security state protects its own, and they're all considered respected veterans at this point. And to call out their record and to say that they made poor decisions or even evil decisions would be hypocritical, considering that they were willing to serve their country. But if you got anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell so that you get notifications every time I upload, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one.